Greetings and welcome to Lesson 2 of INTL 644, Cyber and the Intelligence Cycle. My name's Larry Dietz and it's my pleasure to be your instructor for this course. This week we're going to devote our attention to intelligence preparation of the battlefield and the cyberspace. This is critical for the intelligence cycle because unless the intelligence cycle can deal with the appropriate picture of the battlefield in the context of the operations as given guidance from the commander, the intelligence cycle will not be able to do what it needs to do to help the commander accomplish their mission. Intelligence generally functions at two paces, the steady state and operational. The the operational tempo during an operation is of necessity much quicker than the steady state, which is used to develop more strategic projects and generally has a longer time frame. The characteristics of the cyber domain as they relate to the cyber battle space and the intelligence cycle are the focus of our studies this week. This week we have 4 course objectives we will be addressing. We're going to be concentrating on the nature of the cyber domain. We will also be emphasizing how the cyber world and the military commercial sectors mesh with each other. We will also allude to the nature of technology. The third bullet here is critical because the commercial sector and the military sector often mesh in the cyber domain. From a Homeland Security perspective, the overwhelming majority of the IT infrastructure is actually in commercial hands, not the government sector. Furthermore, the commercial side of cybersecurity, cyber intelligence, and to some extent cyber attack is sometimes more advanced than the military counterpart. The cyber domain is totally man-made, and unlike a political domain, there are no borders, so the cyber domain is borderless. We also note that unlike the natural domains, air, land, sea, ground, individuals can have a disproportionate effect in the cyber domain. Think of Mr. Snowden as an example. The cyber domain does have some real-world connections, such as SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition. You can think of SCADA systems as those that deal with processes in the real world and convert them to digital activities in the cyber world. We will talk about SCADA a little bit more in week 7 when we address the practical exercise. For the most part, intelligence officers are predictors. They need to predict the nature of the enemy's likely course of action and perhaps recommend to the commander or the policymaker what actions the friendly force should take as a result of potential enemy activity. As with the world of signals intelligence, attack vectors on the electronic area can be both attack vectors and collection vectors. That's important to note. The cyberspace can be an equalizer because the amount of investment to enter the cyber domain is relatively small. When we think of challenges, we need to think of them in the context of the operational tempo, the volume of data, and the nature of the attacks. Later on in the lesson, we will talk about a number of these attacks. It is important to emphasize that the dynamic nature of the attack, the way attacks are constantly changing in the cyber domain, is very likely why the cyber domain is much more challenging for intelligence professionals to try and keep pace with activities. It's also important to note that the intelligence cycle, while not present at every organizational level, supports every organizational level. And this must be kept in mind as well. It is impossible, if not impractical, to defend the total cyber domain. Unknown attacks, which are starting to occur with significant frequency, and we'll talk about zero-day attacks and APTs, advanced persistent threats, a little bit later on. These are accelerating in terms of their variety and in terms of appearing on the landscape. It is often very difficult to determine with a high degree of certainty where these attacks are coming from. During the presidential election in October of 2016, the Russians were reported as hacking various and sundry sites related to the U.S. election. These include the candidates as well as some other sites. The analyst is charged with finding how to give their force a cyber advantage in developing the background for the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. At the high level, this is the international strategy for cyberspace, major defense objectives. And the cyber domain requires far more and intense cooperation among nation states than perhaps the physical domains, because physical domains of nations are separated by borders, and that's not the case. The cyber domain, as we mentioned earlier, is borderless. Another dimension here is the legal dimension. Acts that are legal in one jurisdiction may not be legal in another. And we have seen attacks generated against the United States, for example, from other nations. There was a classic case many years ago of a virus that was created in the Philippines and caused significant harm to systems in the United States. However, because the Philippines did not have a law against the creation or use of malicious software and malware, there was no prosecution of the individual, even though he was identified. The Intel cycle has to deal with these four critical vectors as well as some others. We've already talked about threats. The risk to the networks is ever changing, and deterrence. Deterrence is a concept that sometimes is not applicable in the cyber world, because as we've just mentioned, there's just too much in terms of attack variety. The other reason I put this slide in here is that the intelligence cycle can be used both offensively and defensively. And this should be kept in mind as we move along. The National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace lists a number of strategic objectives. And I think you can see that preventing cyber attacks and reducing their impact will require the military to work with counterparts from other parts of the government as well as the private sector. The exact nature of this interaction is frankly beyond the scope of this course, but suffice it to say that last week we saw that Department of Homeland Security is responsible for about half of the sectors in the critical infrastructure. But the military, the Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, often have advanced tactics, techniques, and procedures that can materially assist in the defense effort. The policymakers who are involved with the intelligence cycle sometimes do not have the technology background needed to develop the policies that will be long-term. Also, it's difficult to predict second and third order effects. And the third order effects can be particularly significant. When looking at the impact of a cyber attack, I'd ask you to take the analogy of a pandemic flu, where there are some initial casualties, but over time, the impact becomes severe because of the cascading effect. For example, if in the initial round of casualties, there are a significant number of people involved in trains and trucking, then ultimately, well, not ultimately, but within a reasonable amount of time, several weeks, the food supply will start to dwindle. So these are longer-term effects. These are some of the more common attacks. You might understand that in the intelligence cycle, we will be working with the priority intelligence requirements and essential elements of information that are needed to develop the collection plan to derive the data needed for the analysis and providing the intelligence work product that the commander requires. If we look at analysis of zero-day attacks, a zero-day attack is where an attacker takes advantage of a product flaw that even the manufacturer doesn't understand. Consequently, this would be an unknown attack. We'll talk about vulnerability exploitation in detail next week. The first step in cyber intelligence preparation of the battlefield is understanding what is the network landscape. The network landscape includes inventorying the hardware and the software. It also includes the ability to figure out what versions of each. In parallel, an aggressive inventory is also necessary to determine if there is any shadow information technology. Shadow information technology means technology that is installed without the approval of the organization. This is a rather detailed slide on network protocols analysis. And for those of you who have a SIGINT background, this is traffic analysis, very similar to the tactics and techniques. It's an important first step on both sides of the equation. The threat intelligence is a significant item, but going back 1 second, the commander's staff has an assistant chief of staff for intelligence, given typically on a military staff number 2. That individual has to be just as cognizant of operational considerations as the operations officer, typically the 3. We'll cover this a little bit more down the road. So here are some vendors that are in the growing threat intelligence sector. By way of additional reference, every winter, typically February and March, there is a conference held in San Francisco called the RSA Conference, Romeo Sierra Alpha. RSA stands for Revej, Shamir, and Edelman, who were famous cryptographers who developed a public key algorithm. And the company RSA, which is now a part of EMC, which is now a part of Dell, produces this conference. It's the largest information security conference in the US and probably the world by default. And you can view their keynotes and get their materials for free. And I'd recommend you investigate that a little bit. By way of trying to make this a little bit more concrete, there are 6 steps in an advanced persistent threat type attack. And here is a list of them. So the step 1 is the enemy gains entry. Step 2, the malicious malware, probes around and tries to find the targets where it would need to set itself up to compromise the system. Once they have gotten inside and set up a reliable position, they can then identify access to data. They collect the data, and then they exfiltrate, send it out to a waiting receiver. After that is complete, the software will then erase any trace of itself. There have been many examples of APTs over the last several years. The process, the 6-step process, is also a very typical process that can be used in a number of different kinds of attacks, not just a specific persistent threat. The forum questions for this week, pretty straightforward. Is the cyber domain so different that the classic intelligence cycle is no longer applicable? This is a question that has been debated by the author of our textbook, Mark Pythian in particular. And the second question is one of perspective. Is an analyst better off to think like a defender or an attacker? As with any forum questions, there is no right nor wrong answer to forum questions. We're looking to explore some of the key points made during the week in the lesson And we're looking for good logical arguments. Also, if you have additional references or experience or examples you'd like to cite, please feel free to do so. And I think you'll find it to be a worthwhile exercise. Next week, we're going to look at traditional and new collection techniques such as social media intelligence. And we'll talk a little bit about CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures. And we'll also address a little bit in terms of collaborative intelligence. From a political perspective, it is reasonable to assume that most of our intelligence operations supporting military operations will be joint. Joint meaning more than one country's force. And so we will talk about some of the nuances of joint operations in the upcoming weeks. Thanks for your attention.